Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Sea Grant Water Resources Network's 2023 webinar series. We're here today to talk to you about Sea Grant's response to harmful algal blooms. We have a great number of speakers, fabulous people with us here today, and we're so happy to have you all join us. To get started, wanted to give you all some background information about the Sea Grant Water Resources Network. Hopefully you're all aware of the network and what we do, but essentially it's a professional network of individuals within our Sea Grant programs that are working together to address water-related challenges. We span all of Sea Grant's water resources themes: environment and human health, water infrastructure, land management, restoration and development, as well as water planning and socioeconomics. And those themes came out of the water resources vision that was developed in 2018. If you'd like to join the network, please send me an email or put a message in the chat function in this webinar. The objectives of the webinar series are to raise awareness and visibility of Sea Grant water resources programming within the wider Sea Grant network, as well as to also highlight some of that research, extension, and education, as well as communication activities that we're already doing within the network and becoming more aware of what's happening in various different programs. Not only that, but it also provides an opportunity for strategic thinking around some of these pressing issues. With that, I really want to thank in advance our presenters for today's webinar. We have Betty Stogler from Florida Sea Grant, Julie Matwiyu from Alaska Sea Grant, Lisa Kremski from Florida Sea Grant, and Chris Winslow from Ohio Sea Grant. Those of you that are here with to visit, please feel free to introduce yourselves to the speakers in the chat. With that, let's actually move forward without any further ado. And our first presentation is going to be by Betty Stogler, again, Florida Sea Grant. Betty is the NOAA Harmful Algal Blooms Liaison, which is a federal state partnership position between NOAA's National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science, Coast Watch, the Integrated Ocean Observing System, and the Sea Grant Network. Her work focuses on mitigating harmful algal blooms nationwide by helping to expand and improve forecasting tools through stakeholder collaboration, engagement, and training. Betty has over 2 decades of experience working with stakeholder communities, conducting needs assessments via surveys, focus groups, and community forums, as well as developing community engaged research, monitoring and restoration activities, and leading the development of workshops and symposiums. Betty's going to start off by giving us a broad overview of HABs and Sea Grant. So without further ado, Betty, I'm going to hand the table over to you.
All right, thanks. Okay, we can go to the next slide. All right, so when we were putting together this workshop, and Karen had asked me, like, well, will you help me with a harmful algal bloom workshop or a webinar? One of the questions I had was, what would people be interested in hearing about? So we put together a survey, and Karen kind of sent it out through the Water Resources Network, through various webinars that were already happening and some of the all hands meetings. And what we learned was that people were most interested in what Sea Grant's response was to HABs, not necessarily, the biology of HABs or the ecology of HABs or those types of things. But I always feel like a PowerPoint presentation about HABs should start with a definition of what is a harmful algal bloom. So I like this one from the CDC. The definition is basically in bold. Harmful algal blooms are those rapid growth of algae or cyanobacteria that can cause harm to people, or animals, or the local ecology. But this definition takes it a little bit further, which is why I like it, because it tells us that it includes both prokaryotes, eukaryotes, freshwater, saltwater, phytoplankton, and benthic algae. Next slide. All right. I added this slide because if you're not familiar with the U.S. National Office for Harmful Algal Blooms, you should be. It's a great resource. It is a repository for harmful algal bloom information. The link is on the top right? And Karen will put that in the chat. On the website, they have lots of interesting information, including a timeline of harmful algal blooms. And it's interesting to note that the first documented harmful algal bloom dates back to 47 million years ago. Next slide. But we're here to talk about our response to HABs. And as I look across the National Sea Grant Network, there's so many examples of great programs in different states. And we're going to hear about 3 of them today. But if we think about our response to HABs from the National Sea Grant perspective, probably the greatest investment in HABs, or at least single investment in HABs, was the creation of the funding of the NOAA Harmful Algal Bloom Liaison Project. Next slide. This project is what supports my position. I've been in it for just over a year and a half. And as Karen mentioned, liaisons are a partnership between Sea Grant and at least one federal agency. In my case, 6 Sea Grant programs, 2 federal partners with collaboration from 5 IU's regional associations went together to create the project that supports my position, but my position serves the entire Sea Grant network. Next slide, please. So when I came on board as the Sea Grant liaison for harmful algal blooms, one of the things that I wanted to know was I wanted to get to know the Sea Grant partners that created my position better. And so I did some meet and greets. These were 30 minutes. And I wanted to know, what are the HABs they're facing? Who are their partners? And how do these HABs affect the people that they work with? I took that last question and I put it into a word cloud, and this is what it comes up with. And I think this probably applies to more than just those 6 programs when we look at what's mentioned here. Next slide, please. But as I dig deeper and I start looking, talking to more people, talking to more Sea Grant programs, to their partners, state agencies. I was looking at our research funding, who's doing what types of research in the different state programs, what type of extension work we're doing. There is some commonalities across the Sea Grant network, and one of the greatest ones is that cyanoHABs are huge. The states that I mentioned here is not all inclusive. They're just the ones that came to mind when I was putting together the PowerPoint. But several people mentioned small lakes, cyanobacteria in small lakes. That we have a lot of emphasis on big lakes, but we don't have a lot of emphasis on those smaller lakes. Also, cyanoHABs that are impacting the coast are, and this is kind of an emerging issue that a lot of states are seeing, and these cyanoHABs are interacting with activities along the coast like aquaculture and causing issues. Before I move to the next slide, going back to those small lakes, I did want to point you to a new blog post that I have, which was summarizing a paper by Schaefer et al. From last year, where he quantified the spatial extent of cyanobacteria blooms in lakes across different geographic scales of the US. And this did not include any of the big lakes like the Great Lakes or Lake Okeechobee. Next slide, please. All right. So another cross-cutting theme across the Sea Grant programs is HAB impacts to aquaculture, and not just the typical ones. When we think about HABs as impacts to humans, as it if they eat shellfish that is contaminated by HABs, but also siting of aquaculture, and then also the impacts of HABs to various life stages of the shellfish organisms themselves, particularly in the hatchery and nursery stages. Next slide. So these are the things that I try to bring to my federal partners. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about those federal partners, what they do, and what resources they have available. So my first federal partner is with the NCAUSE Harmful Algal Bloom Forecasting Branch. And within NCAUSE, they do many things, but one of the things that they do is to support harmful algal bloom monitoring and forecasting. Most of this is supported through research funding, and not all of it is done by NCAUSE or my specific partners. There's a lot of people involved in monitoring and forecasting, a lot of academic institutions and other federal partner state agencies. And it often takes multiple people together to produce a forecast. But my federal partners do work on developing forecasts, and oftentimes those are satellite derived, but not always. And some things to note about the use of satellites in forecasts is, although they're wonderful because they can see large expanses, they can't detect individual species. They can't see blooms that are at very low concentrations that don't discolor the water. And they can't tell you whether a bloom is toxic or not. So just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, these are products that are currently available by my federal partners at NCAUSE. These are all produced using satellites that detect ocean color. So what's important to note here is that they are looking at specific wavelengths where chlorophyll and phytoplankton or phycocyanin might be present. And when you get away from the open ocean, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So an algorithm that works really well in Southwest Florida in the clear coastal or the clear waters of the Gulf of Mexico is not going to work in Chesapeake Bay. And so a different algorithm may have to be used. And in the freshwater systems where we're interested in cyano blooms, a different algorithm, again, is used. So what's on the page is the algorithm that is most useful for those areas. These are the ones they put out for the public, but they do run all of their algorithms for all of these areas because we are interested in things like cyano blooms to the coast. Next slide. And so this is a product that they recently made available to Chesapeake Bay state managers. During COVID, the state managers couldn't get out to sample, and but they still needed to know when and where blooms were occurring. So they put together this portal. It's kind of on the back end of things because you really don't want the public to go in and see all of these different products and not understand what they mean. But it did prove to be very useful. So now they're thinking about how they can make this more operationalized for other areas. And I think Karen did put the link to this website in the chat. Next slide. Here's another product. This one does not use satellite. This was developed for the Gulf of Mexico. Here we have Karenia brevis, which is a dinoflagellate. One of the unique things about Karenia brevis is that the cells often become aerosolized and cause respiratory irritation in individuals. And because the cells do not come on shore, they're patchy when they come on shore. They're not everywhere. And because the respiratory irritation is largely driven by wind speed and direction, it's really important for people to know which beaches they can attend at different times because our economy is driven by tourism and beachgoers. So HabScope is a citizen science project that's driven by machine learning. So volunteers are trained to collect a water sample. They put that sample under a microscope, take a 30-second video with an iPod, and then they upload that to a website where machine learning actually counts the cells. If you can click on that little image there, it should show you this is what it looks like. That cell count is then combined with wind speed and direction to produce a forecast that is updated every 3 hours for 24 hours. And then my role in this is really developing the training materials for the Citizen Science Network. Next slide. course, iPods are getting really hard to come by. You can't even get them on eBay anymore. So a new grant is allowing this project to expand and improve. So we're transitioning to Raspberry Pi technology and to two new harmful algal bloom species, Alexandrium monolithum and Pyridinium bahamense. Both of these produce a saxitoxin, which causes paralytic shellfish poisoning if contaminated seafood is eaten. And what's really cool about this is that the Raspberry Pi technology has improved magnification and optics. So we're now getting at cell counts that are useful for aquaculture. Next slide, please. Oh, and that's some Alexandrium. So my other federal partner is Coastwatch, and they make satellite information available to anyone who wants to use it. Primarily, the NCOS folks rely on Ocean Color. Coastwatch makes all different kinds of satellite products available. So they're not just have focused, they are focused on lots of different things. Next slide. They operate through a central operations and then nodes that are located around the US. Next slide. Those nodes maintain a library of satellite data products that are specific for the region, and they also serve as that local point of contact for that region. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one. Next slide. Okay, so one of the barriers to using satellite data is often knowing, what information do I use? How do I use it? How do I access it? How do I work with it in my project? And so Coastwatch put together a learning portal, and this includes lectures, hands-on tutorials. All of these are available electronically through this website, but we also teach them in virtual classes. These are tailored to the audience, so they can focus on fisheries, on aquaculture, on water quality, whatever you want. And up until recently, they have been really focused on other parts of NOAA who are interested in using satellite. So my interest and my role in this is really helping them to expand their training courses, the information that we're teaching. So we just put together a water quality module, a seagrass tutorial, and next slide. And we now have a satellite course that is in session, like literally as we speak, that was targeted to Sea Grant and its partners. So this went out through several of the Sea Grant networks, and we have about 33 people in the class, both Sea Grant as well as academia and their state agency, Sea Grant state agency partners. So I'm excited about that. Next slide. All right, going back to those small water bodies, something that I'm really excited about. Currently, the most useful satellite is Sentinel-3. This has produces the most frequent images as well. And it also has it reads at many spectral bands, and so it's very useful, but it has a pixel size of 300 meters, which is roughly the size of a football field. So it's not super useful in small tributaries or small lakes, because anytime a pixel touches land, it has to be thrown away. So on that upper left-hand picture where you see all that gray, those are pixels that touched land. There's another satellite that's called Sentinel-2. It has a great spectral resolution of 20 meters or spatial resolution of 20 meters, but it's not quite as spectrally, can we go back, tuned in, and it doesn't produce images as frequently, but we think it can be really useful in these small tributaries and small lakes. And so the folks that I've been working with at NCOS have been working on developing algorithms for Sentinel-2, and the folks at Coastwatch are working to run those algorithms for the entire US, and then they will be making those available as experimental products. And so I think those are going to be really useful, particularly for some of your state partners. Next slide. All right, I've been doing a pretty busy putting together workshops the last few months. We did one with US Habs, another with Chesapeake Bay, and I see Susanna Music on here. I want to give her a shout out because she helped coordinate and also hosted the workshop at VIMS. These workshops were designed to help my federal partners get a sense of what the needs are on the ground so that they can develop more useful products that are more likely to be used. Next slide. And one of the things that we did going into planning of the workshop to make sure the agenda was useful was put together a pre-workshop survey. I'm focusing on this slide because one of the questions that we asked was, how do you currently receive your information? And then a follow-up was, how would you like to receive your information? And with the industry, they overwhelmingly said they'd like to receive their information via a phone app. So, and this came up a lot during the workshop as well. So I want you to hold that thought. Next slide. So another group that I'm working with is a satellite aquaculture working group. This working group was put together by Clete Otashi from the NOAA's Office of Aquaculture. And he put it together with Coast Watch because they wanted to find out how satellite could be useful for aquaculture siting. And so we've been meeting over the last several months. But he learned about this workshop that I did and asked me to give an update at our last meeting, which was Monday. And I did, and we had a lot of discussion about this app and how we might be able to play a role in bringing resources together for industry, making satellite more available. And so one of the things that we thought we would work towards is a data portal where satellite images that are useful for aquaculture would all be pulled into a single portal, not an app, but they could be easily available. And if somebody from, let's just say the Northeast has a portal already, they can easily access those resources and pull them into their own portal. So we are working forward towards that. So that was a nice early outcome of the workshop. I will also give a shout out to Chuck Worrich from the National Sea Grant Office, who invited us to present at the Sea Grant Aquaculture Chats, because that generated some additional discussion with some of the Northeast aquaculture specialists and Shelley Tomlinson from NCAUSE. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm almost done. In terms of engagement, my engagement across the network, I do have a quarterly e-newsletter if you're interested and you're not already receiving it. With that e-news, I send out project updates, announcements, and any blog posts that I produce. All of those things are also contained on the Florida Sea Grant website. And so Karen is putting that link in the chat. So those resources are available to you. But one of the things that I'm wanting to do moving forward, and I've actually been wanting to do this for a while, is kind of playing off the Sea Grant Aquaculture Chats, is to create a Sea Grant Hab Chats. It's gotten derailed every time I try to move it forward, but thanks to Monica Wilson from Florida Sea Grant, who is currently helping me, we think we're ready to announce it later this week or early next week. These will be once a month, and we're going to kick them off with a topic-driven or question-driven session just to direct the conversation. But my goal is to make these available to anyone within the Sea Grant network who's interested in HABs, make them very informal so that we can have some frank conversations about harmful algal blooms. And I'm going to stop there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. We really appreciate that. And now what we're going to do is we actually have 3 speakers from across the network. We have Julie Matt Weyu from Alaska, and Lisa Kremsky from Florida, and Chris Winslow from Ohio, that are going to actually highlight 3 different programs that they're doing to highlight not only regional efforts, but also specific projects, and also span the different Sea Grant functional areas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie. Julie is the Alaska Sea Grant Marine Advisory Program agent for the Kodiak Island Archipelago. She holds a master's degree in biological oceanography with a research emphasis in paralytic shellfish poisoning. As a Marine Advisory Program agent, she works to bring relevant training and information to fishermen, engages in community outreach and education activities, and works with local and statewide organizations to sustain healthy coastal ecosystems and marine literacy. She is active in research, service, and education related to paralytic shellfish poisoning, and continues to work towards safe shellfish harvest and related harmful algal blooms monitoring and forecasting efforts in the Kodiak region. Thank you very much for joining us today, Julie, and I will hand it over to you.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, it's really nice to be here today. Yeah, it's really nice for the invitation. This is my first Sea Grant Water Resource Network meeting that I've attended, but it's really nice to connect with my colleagues across the nation interested in or working with HABs. I'm happy to share some of the work that we do here in Alaska. And my name is Julie, and I'm an extension agent in Kodiak. I'm a general extension agent, so my work looks like a lot of things. I do a lot of marine safety training, training to commercial fishermen, but a large focus of my time has been working with paralytic shellfish poisoning in this region, because it's a really big problem in the Kodiak region. But today I'm going to kind of step back and give a quick overview of HABs in Alaska and how Alaska Sea Grant in general and the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network is working to address the problems here in our state. Next slide. So in Alaska, we have both toxic and non-toxic HAB species. Our biggest problem is with paralytic shellfish poisoning. The presence of PSP toxin producing phytoplankton and PSP toxins is very common and pervasive throughout the state. We do have the diatoms that cause amnesic shellfish poisoning. They're present in the water, but the toxins are rare, and we have not had any we've had only detected low concentrations of AS or amnesic shellfish toxins in our shellfish. To date, we have not had any confirmed ASP illnesses in our state. And as people are focusing on HABs and HAB monitoring, we are identifying the cells that produce diuretic shellfish toxins. But again, the toxins have not been recorded, and it hasn't been a primary concern to date. So paralytic shellfish poisoning is our biggest problem. PSP in Alaska is caused by the dinoflagellate Alexandrium, which produces saxitoxin, which is a potent neurotoxin. The saxitoxin acts as a sodium channel blocker and disrupts normal nerve function, which can lead to paralysis. And I think this group knows that the filter feeding shellfish can consume the algae and concentrate the toxins, which are then passed up through the food chain. People become sick through consumption of contaminated bivalves, predatory snails, and crab viscera. There's a number of symptoms here with paralytic shellfish poisoning. It includes tingling, numbness, nausea, headache, shortness of breath, and in extreme cases, paralysis of the extremities, and eventually respiratory paralysis and death. We have had a number of illnesses and even deaths in Kodiak. I work closely with people who have had PSP. I had one of my local samplers was actually years prior, he actually became paralyzed on the beach consuming shellfish. Yeah, so it's a real problem here. It's really imperative to seek medical care as soon as any symptoms present, because the illness can progress rapidly from mild to severe very quickly. There's no known antidote, but a person can recover with proper supportive treatment. Therefore, I do a lot of education and outreach in my community, because everyone in our coastal communities need to be aware of the problem of PSP. Next slide. So PSP affects our commercial fisheries and our subsistence or recreational fisheries. The Alaska commercial shellfish industry is very well regulated, and all commercial products are closely monitored, with all shellfish fisheries subject to testing or processing. However, this translates to increased costs due to testing or ex-vessel loss. And additionally, PSP has impacted expansion of the mariculture industry in Alaska. And while the commercial industry is well regulated, our state does not have a routine monitoring program for subsistence or recreational shellfish due to the length of our coastlines, the remoteness of our beaches, and our low population here in the state. So it is a real problem. It's a longstanding problem too, and it remains a serious health risk for Alaskan coastal residents. Subsistence shellfish harvesters in Alaska are exposed to high PSP risk due to their dependency on shellfish resources, their strong cultural traditions and connection to the resource, and sometimes limited access to medical care. We've had people die en route to medical care in our community. So it's really important that people know the risks of shellfish, eating untested shellfish, and be prepared to seek medical care if they need it. So because their state does not have a routine monitoring program, different regional monitoring programs have cropped up around the state to address the problem. Community-based monitoring has proven to be an effective strategy to reduce PSP risks, and folks are working to open up harvest and hold programs or monitoring programs to help keep people safe, as well as access the resource. Next slide. As these community and regional efforts developed and more attention was given to the increasing risk of HABs in our state, there was interest and need for a coordinated network. Alaska Sea Grant and Alaska Ocean Observatory System organized a statewide HAB workshop in 2016, bringing together different organizations, tribes, and agencies addressing HABs to discuss and share current efforts and gaps. Out of this discussion, the Alaska Harmful Algal Bloom Network was formed in 2017 and brings a statewide approach to HAB awareness, research, monitoring, and response in Alaska. Our director, Dr. Jenny Eckert, has played a really key role in organizing and maintaining this network. The AHAB network offers a space to share information and coordinate regional efforts. The network hosts a website that features robust information on HABs, upcoming events, recent news, links to regional monitoring programs, and to experts in the field. Key contacts are listed, and certainly any HAB alerts or impacts to wildlife are shared with this network. The network has pulled together researchers and communities and has opened a platform for sharing and learning. There's a lot of concern, especially among our remote and tribal residents, and they don't have the direct access to researchers. So this is a really nice platform for them to come in and learn what is being done and what can be done in their communities. Some real-time data is currently shared on the network, but that data platform is growing. There's only a small amount of information that's able to be shared real-time. But the network offers a coordinated and unified voice for Alaska and encourages collaborations within the state. The website and the data portal provides information, hopefully for stakeholders to access to make informed decisions about shellfish harvest. As I mentioned, our state does not have a routine monitoring program, so our residents are looking for a centralized location or a way to find this information. But most of our residents are still looking locally for this information. While the AHAB is a robust platform and it's really nice to have this connection, most of our coastal residents are, looking for local information and seeking local experts. So for this reason, it's really important for Alaska Sea Grant to stay connected at the community level and be able to directly respond to our communities or put them in contact with other experts. In Kodiak, I work really closely with the Kodiak Area Native Association and local tribes to continue some level of monitoring in my region. So I have some information to share regarding PSP blooms. Our funding throughout the years has been intermittent, and that's a problem. It's really nice to have data on hand to share out, as opposed to, I'm not really sure what's happening in my region right now. But even the Kodiak archipelago is such a complex system that it's very challenging to stay current and updated. As many of you know, paralytic shellfish poisoning is temporal and spatially variable, and it really makes a difference to which beach you're testing. So I've come to the conclusion that we need beach specific testing and almost a harvest and hold program in place to fully protect our residents. Next slide. This map just demonstrates that paralytic shellfish toxins are found throughout the state of Alaska, with high concentrations found in Southeast Alaska and the Kodiak region, the circle with my picture there, and in this Alaska Peninsula area. These are known hotspots for toxins. We've had this problem for decades, and the Gulf of Alaska is pretty well documented this problem with paralytic shellfish poisoning. But as we look more and reach out into the Arctic, we are finding that Alexandrium cells and the toxins are in the Bering Sea and up into the Chukchi seas. Our gnome-based agent, Gay Sheffield, has been very active in the last few years, responding to subsistence food concerns and educating her community about HABs, since this is a relatively new problem in their region. They also have a unique problem in that the communities in Western Alaska are not only consuming bivalves, but a large part of their diet is consumption of other marine resources, including tunicates, sea stars, marine mammals, and we really don't have a real strong understanding of how the toxins move through that food system. So yeah, Sea Grant remains active with research, monitoring, outreach and education, rapid response, as well as the AHAB network. And I wanted to give a shout out to, I work very closely with NCOS researchers out of the Beaufort, North Carolina lab, and I really appreciate their support. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We really appreciate that overview of the Alaska HAB network. Just to let everybody know, we are going to have a panel discussion with all 4 of our speakers at the end. So we'll have time for questions at that point. If you have questions along the way, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat as well. Next up, we have Lisa. Lisa is an extension faculty with University of Florida and the Florida Sea Grant program. As a water resource regional specialized agent, Lisa's efforts focus primarily on water quality and harmful algal blooms in coastal and estuarine ecosystems actually. Her programs help solve water resources issues that are critical to the economic development and environmental protection in the state of Florida. She received her PhD in marine biosciences from the University of Delaware and her BS in environmental science and policy from the University of Maryland. With all of that, Lisa's going to talk to us today about how the State of the Science Symposium led to the HABs communication plan for the state of Florida and the HABs task force. With that, Lisa, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm excited to be talking about some of Florida Sea Grant efforts, specifically in the realm of extension and communications. Next slide. So this is a completely non-comprehensive overview of HABs in Florida, but essentially what this map is meant to show you is that Florida is arguably a major hotspot for HABs in both national and global context. So if you look at that picture, if there's a water body, be it freshwater, estuarine, or marine, man-made or natural, it's likely to be able to host a HAB organism. And because of that, the state actually monitors more than 50 harmful algal bloom species. And we do have saxitoxin, brevetoxin, and atoxin producing species in Florida. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, there you go. Most of Florida Sea Grant's efforts really started in 2018 as a result of 2 simultaneous harmful algal blooms impacting the state. So the first was a freshwater cyanobacteria bloom that occurred in the state's largest lake, Lake Okeechobee, due to regulatory discharge the algal bloom actually got dispersed to the coastal estuaries, both on the west and east coast. We also had a red tide event, marine dinoflagellate, Carenia brevis, in the Gulf of Mexico, which persisted for 17 months and impacted all 3 of the state's coasts. So in terms of the frequency, severity, and the coincidence of these 2 blooms, it led to major societal, environmental, and economic impacts. And as a result, the governor executed executive order, which essentially created the Blue-Green Algae Task Force and reinstated the Harmful Algal Bloom Task Force, which addresses marine HABs, essentially to expedite the progress towards reducing those adverse impacts, really understanding what those impacts are, and then providing technical expertise to understand sort of the causes, mitigation, and management for these blooms. Next. And to put it into context from one of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force members is we're trying to manage a problem that we don't really understand. And so at the start of these task forces and the initiation of them, before they really delved down into providing these recommendations, it became readily apparent that we really needed to have a concerted effort to get all of the HAB scientists and managers into a safe space together to assess where we are regarding the state of the science, to maybe help move that progress forward. And so in 2019, we established the Florida Harmful Algal Bloom State of the Science Symposium with a primary objective really to facilitate that exchange of information and networking opportunities amongst a group of individuals who really never got the opportunity to meet in person in a safe space. And so ultimately, the success of this symposium was due to the engagement of our state agencies and the national agency partners from the beginning as members of the steering committee, so that they really had buy-in in the process as well as the product. Next slide. And so the product of that was this consensus document, really assessing what we know, what we think we know, and what we need to know for these blooms, with a focus on identifying and ranking research priorities for these blooms. And so again, because this came from the community, there was ultimately buy-in from this consensus product as to where we were regarding the state of HABs in Florida. Next step, next slide. And because of this, the Harmful Algal Bloom Task Force, which had many members that were part of the steering committee and were part of the participants, in their first consensus document, they actually used some of the research gaps, identified needs, and research priorities as the foundation for their initial recommendations. And ultimately, what they came up with was a summary of recommendations that addressed public health needs, communications, management response, and research priorities, which ultimately sort of got their start and allowed them to make initial progress in their recommendations from the results that came out of the symposium in 2019. Next slide. We were fortunate enough to receive the grant to develop that communication for red tide, the communication strategy for red tides in Florida. And for any of you who know the extension impact model, it's essentially, you hope for knowledge gain with that medium-term impact of getting behavior change, ultimately to receive those societal, environmental, and economic impacts. But when you're talking about communications and outreach and education, really people are at the heart of that. You have to recognize that real and perceived knowledge, behavior, and impacts differ depending on who that person is, what their perceptions and values are. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all scenario, and you really need to have that thorough understanding and evaluation of these perceptions and make sure that it's a two-way dialogue. And so I think what was really unique about this project was that we received feedback from those individuals who are responsible for disseminating the information about harmful algal blooms, but also from those various end users. And those end users come from different perspectives. So we have the scientific community, natural resource and public health officials, tourism, hospitality, small businesses, media, And as anyone in Extension knows, the general public, there's really no such thing as the general public. So we made sure to parse that out into those based off of their activities or actions that were going to impact their behavioral intentions. So we looked at commercial and recreational fishers, boaters, whether or not people were seafood consumers and whether or not they were asthmatics. And so that we can make sure that we were meeting them at a place that was allow them to make the most informed behavioral decisions in order for the protection of their public health, the environment, or the economy based off of what was most important to them. And you notice from many of our stakeholders that we engaged, their values were often in conflict with one another. And so again, making sure that we had all of these individuals and these end users as part of the conversation really allowed for a robust strategy that could be useful for the various stakeholders that get impacted by red tides in Florida. Next slide. And so what that's led to is Florida Sea Grant on that red side of that right-hand side of the image. We now have either membership on the task force and all of the sub-working groups of the task force, or are actively facilitating those working groups. And so not only are we providing those recommendations, being those seen as that source of sort of that safe space for harmful algal bloom information, but we're actually helping to do the application of the recommendations, which is what you always hope for in terms of extension of being able to apply the science. And although the first symposium was probably most beneficial for the HAB task force because of where they were in the planning process, the blue-green algae task force, which is now looking to make some robust recommendations in terms of research, mitigation, and management priorities, they've actually contracted with us to host a second State of the Science Symposium specifically for blue-green algae blooms in Florida. And so we're looking forward to building on the 2019 symposium and being able to assess what research knowledge has progressed since 2019 and where new gaps in perhaps research priorities since that last 4 years. So I look forward to questions at the end. And next slide, I just want to thank obviously all of my collaborators and vendors. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We really appreciate that overview. And last but not least, we have Chris Winslow from Ohio Sea Grant, who's going to talk to us about establishing Ohio Sea Grant as the one-stop clearinghouse for information and science advancement for HABs in Lake Erie. Chris actually coordinates Ohio Sea Grant's Great Lakes research and outreach with agencies and universities, as well as assisting in research and curriculum development at the Ohio State University Stone Laboratory and Island Research Campus on Lake Erie. Chris earned his BS from Ohio University and both his MS and PhD from Bowling Green State University. And prior to coming to Sea Grant, Chris was an assistant professor at Kutztown University of Pennsylvania. Chris is the U.S. co-chair of the International Joint Commission's Science Advisory Board, is the executive director of the Lake Erie Area Research Network, and engages with multiple committees assisting with Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement annexes. With that, Chris, thanks for joining us, and I will hand it over to you.
Absolutely, thanks you. How's the audio?
It's good from this end.
Perfect. All right, well, I'll hop into kind of what Ohio Sea Grant did in response to the harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie. If we can go to the next slide, you'll see a map that shouldn't be unique to folks. This is a product of NCOS, which we've heard about earlier today. Basically, this large polygon you're seeing here is the western basin of Lake Erie into the central basin. Typical heat map, warmer colors mean high bloom severity or biomass, cooler colors mean lower density, and then black is non-detect. What you'll see from this slide is we've had presence of these blooms since the early 2000s. So 2002 was in the upper left-hand corner, all the way down through last year, but I only have 2021 shown here. And you can see that the severity and the location of these blooms varies from year to year. But this is what we've been working on in Lake Erie for, as you can see, the last two decades. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to give you an image of what this looks like on the ground. So on the right-hand side, you're looking at a satellite photo of those blooms. This is in 2011. This is currently our second worst bloom on record. What's unique about this one is rather than the bloom just being concentrated in the western basin here, it's actually spent some time moving out into the eastern basin. So you're seeing some changes in its location. Also, you'll see on the left-hand side how bad these blooms can really be. We talk to our charter captains and recreational boaters, and they'll actually feel their vessels bogged down in these blooms. They can get that thick. Next slide, please, if you can. So what you're seeing here basically for us is, although we've had these blooms present since, as I mentioned, early 2000s, really this got elevated for the state and for Lake Erie in 2014, when basically the city of Toledo had to put out a do not drink advisory. If you're not familiar with the Great Lakes and Toledo specifically, this is a city of about 500,000 people. And on this day, this was a Saturday, woke up to the fact that they were unable to drink, cook, or even brush their teeth with the water. As you can imagine, there was tremendous impact from this event. I've got some of this listed here. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list. But as far as the cost of the marine industry, we have seen and continue to see reduced slip rentage. So annually, not as many boats are in the water and using slips. Working with the charter captain business, we do have a great relationship through our extension educators in the state of Ohio. We're seeing that their business is down. We've seen estimates around a 4% reduction over the last 2 decades. And just to put that into perspective for everybody, the fishery in this area is estimated at about $1.5 billion. So not a minor impact. We've also been working with our stakeholders and have found and detected a cost in water, not only testing, so to be out on the front edge of these and figure out what our water treatment facilities need to do to remove these toxins from the water, but also the additional cost of the treatment. Many of our plants have had to change to using ozone or UV radiation, and even just as simple as increasing the amount of activated carbon that they have to purchase on an annual basis. We've seen multiple economic studies come out, some of our staff involved in these, to look at the impact to businesses along the Lake Erie shoreline. And we've seen studies published to date that range anywhere from a $2 million to $10 million impact for a 72-hour advisory. And then the last one I'll highlight here, and again, this is not meant to be exhaustive, but what also came out of this was this negative attention on ag in the state. Definitely our producers, our farmers in the state know that a lot of the nutrients are coming from their practices and from their fields. And many of them are deploying best practices to reduce that runoff. But early on in this crisis or in this battle with HABs, we've seen people really get negative towards farmers without really any data to support their arguments. If you could advance just to show you some more pictures of what this looks like for us in Erie. So what you're seeing in the middle picture, the large one that came from the National Ocean Services, that's the Maumee River coming into Lake Erie, and you can see the thickness and how homogeneous these blooms are in that basin. And then you can see on the left-hand side, this is just and this is in Lake Michigan, but this is, you can see how the bloom gets so much that it forms these scums or foams on the beach. Next slide, please. So these HABs aren't gone, and it's still an issue for the state, for the lake. But I would say one of the keys to success is what a Sea Grant program does, and it's that 3 pillars or 3 legs of the stool: that's extension, research, and education. But I'd argue that all 3 of those facets can't move forward without communication with key stakeholders. So we have a comms team that tries as best it can to spread itself into the extension efforts, the research efforts, and also our formal education component. I would say that we have been seen as a trusted, unbiased resource for the state for many, many decades prior to me even joining the program. And so I know this is true for all of our 34 Sea Grant programs, but that's not trivial. That the work that we do, we really come at it with open mind and unbiased. And so that's, in my opinion, fantastic. So what I'm going to show you, if we click on the next slide or advance a little bit, I'm going to highlight some things that we needed to have established. I would argue that some of these were already established before the HABs came to Lake Erie, but these are things that I think have resulted in us kind of being referenced as this clearinghouse for HABs information for Lake Erie. So the first one is we have had a long-term relationship with local and regional media outlets. I've got a couple examples here. Every year up at Stone Laboratory, so our island campus in Lake Erie, we host a 2-day science writers conference. So we actively engage our science writers and bring them to us rather than them searching on their own for facts and maybe sensationalized information out there about HABs. We bring them to the island and we usher over a 2-day period 15 or 16 scientists to talk about the issues that are on Lake Erie. And we've been very fortunate to work with NOAA, again, NCOS specifically. Annually, we have a HABs forecast that occurs in June, late June. And oftentimes we bring our media partners and media friends to that event so that they can interview scientists and researchers at that event. We have a longstanding, in my opinion, a positive relationship with our state and federal agencies. For us in Ohio Sea Grant, all of our RFPs, even those that come out, the NOAA money that comes through our programs, our advisory board are heavily populated by these state and federal agencies. And so they definitely guide our RFP in the priorities that we highlight in them. We definitely have a strong network of scientists. So our Sea Grant RFP, so annual or every other year when we put out our RFP, we've got a list that we maintain of about 800, 900 faculty across the state of Ohio that we work with. You'll see the phrase here, learn. About 4 years ago, myself and Associate Director Kristen Fussell wrote an NSF planning grant to build a statewide consortium of academic institutions. We call that LEARN for Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network. And I would argue that this has done a great job of connecting the researchers across all of our 14 four-year institutions, but also it's provided a conduit for our state and federal agencies to identify resources and experts within our state. We've had a good, strong state and federal relationship with the legislature. Like the Science Writers event, we utilize our island to make connections with stakeholders and decision makers. And so every year we have 2 separate 1-day decision maker days. And basically we do the same thing with the Science Writers. We bring anywhere from county commissioners and mayors to local communities, all the way up to, again, state and federal elected House and Senate folks. And so they come up to the island and get to meet the researchers and ask questions and let us know what their stakeholders, what their constituents are interested in. And through time, not only myself, but I would argue a lot of our state extension agents are kind of that speed dial for our elected officials. When there's an issue that bubbles up, they think a Sea Grant. And the other thing that I would highlight, the academic research we fund and the publications that come out of there are phenomenal, but many of our endpoint audiences are not going into those scientific journals. So we've worked hard to develop white papers out of some of the stuff we're doing, especially for this talk in the HAB space. And so we have a lot of state and federal folks that are, testifying or asking us to come in and testify to use these white papers, because we really try and distill these hardcore scientific journal articles into digestible documents. And then not just myself, but again, the full Sea Grant Stone Lab team are active on many key boards and committees. As Karen highlighted before, I get to sit on the International Joint Commissions Board, which is a fairly important commission here in the Great Lakes. And I get to sit on some of the work that's going on in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Next slide, please. The last thing I'd like to kind of highlight, there's multiple slides that deal with this topic, but what we have benefited from in Lake Erie in the state of Ohio is when that advisory came out in 2014. In the following year, the Ohio Department of Higher Education mobilized $2 million annually to fund research to inform management decisions. We call this the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative, as you can see on the title for this slide. And basically the state came to Ohio Sea Grant and one of our partner institutions in the University of Toledo, and we run this $2 million competition for them annually. When we sat down, my first phone calls were to the Department of Health, EPA in Ohio, Department of Natural Resources, and then the Department of Ag. And so every RFP that comes out, and sometimes they come out annually, sometimes we hold that pot of money and do a 2-year slug of competition, but every priority listed on that RFP comes from a state agency, and it relates to how they manage or deal with HABs. These are the 4 high-level themes of this initiative. One is basically they want to know how to produce safe drinking water. These blooms are here, they're producing these toxins. How do we make sure that we don't have another drinking water advisory? The second kind of theme or area where we're funding a lot of research is in the human health space. So if you do become exposed, whether through drinking water or recreational, what impacts could you see on the body? What is the typical route of exposure? Those sorts of things. Another big one was how blooms behave. This is all the way down to the fact that we now know the 10 genes that are required to produce those toxins. This is critically important because it'll help give us information on, is the community in that bloom right now likely to produce toxins or not? When will these blooms show up? When won't they? Where will the toxins be distributed in the water column? And last but not least, a lot of this research effort has gone to addressing nutrient runoff. And so we've put a lot of effort into that. Next slide, please. So I'm happy to report to date, we've had quite a bit of money run through here. So from FY15 to FY20, so 6 years, we were dealing with or managing $2 million in research grants. We'd shown success, in my opinion, over that time period, that in FY21 and 22, the Department of Higher Education bumped up our budget to $2.5 million annually. So what does that mean? Basically about $17 million and 120 projects have been funded since 2015. I can definitely tell you when you're managing these dollars and what you envision happening out of the gates changes through time. And so I'm just going to highlight kind of the learning curve that we went through here in Ohio. So if we just progress and put those bullets up here, what we were required to do from the state was to produce an annual report. And they gave us instruction to follow kind of the Sea Grant way and write that at kind of a 7th grade science education level. And we did that. But what we found out quickly is that the agencies who were driving these research priorities realized that for them to make actual management decisions or pass regs or modify rules, that they needed more than just a lay description of what we discovered. So now we are annually having a conference, and the conference right now is not open to the general public. Basically what it is for 2 days in a row, we have about 60 state agency staff online, and we just bring every researcher that was funded in that year, and they give a science-heavy conference-style presentation to those agencies. The RFP priority has shifted. I showed you the 4 different kind of themes or focus areas on the previous slide. What we found out is that early on, what we focused most of our attention on was human health. And I would also add the water treatment, because those are things that needed to happen in the here and now. Because we've done now multiple years of this RFP, the priorities are shifting a little bit away from health and go more towards nutrient reduction. I'll also say that we have now learned that other money has been invested in the state of Ohio. I have it listed here parenthetically as the H2 Ohio. So our governor has mobilized about $170, $180 million a year to help farmers out and to upgrade wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants. And what they did, the governor's office, is basically came to us and said, hey, you're doing this HABS research initiative to answer management questions for agencies. Well, now we're actually putting money to boots on the ground practices. Can you not only do research that informs management decisions, but also corrects the deployment of these dollars in the field? So they wanted to use it to make sure that what they were doing on the landscape, whether it's incorporating fertilizer through certain practices, or whether it was using ozone instead of UV radiation, which ones of those are better to do? The other thing I would argue, when this money first came out, as you can imagine with state dollars, sometimes they don't want you taking indirects, so IDCs, out of a budget. They want all the money to go to research, not 57% to go to the university. And they also want you to match these things dollar for dollar. What we were able to show through time is that this made it very difficult for the researchers to come to the table. So what they have done now is waive match, and they've also lowered the IDCs relative to the federally negotiated rate. And then one other lesson we learned in our RFPs, and maybe we're slow to learn this relative to other Sea Grant programs, but before we used to say we have X millions of dollars and we anticipate funding Y number of projects. What we've quickly learned is if you don't tell them how many projects you're going to ask for, you get some pretty cool and creative projects. As you all probably know, if you say we're going to do, we have $2 million, we're going to fund 10 projects, they divide 2 million by 10 projects, and that's where their budget hits. So we've learned a little bit from that. Next slide. I know we want to get to the kind of open discussion with the focus members, but I just wanted to show you, and you'll have access to this PowerPoint. These are the priorities that we called or we asked for the agencies. So we know what the DNR wants, we know what the ag wants, we know what the commission wants. And so again, our RFPs are very tailored to the state agencies. Next slide. And so what I can show you here is that these are things that H2 Ohio project, so this is the governor again paying for practices on the ground, not our research. Every one of these 10 things here on the left-hand side, whether it's soil testing or wetland placement or drainage water management, all of these practices and their success are being evaluated by the research that we're funding. And so really we're taking research to inform management decisions. And with that, I've got just the question slide at the end. So I think that's all I had.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We really appreciate that information. We are now going to open up for a panel discussion. Brooke Starry, who is the Coastal Environmental Quality Program Specialist with South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium, is going to actually MC our panel discussion. So Brooke, I will turn it over to you and let you run with things and tell people how you want to run the panel discussion.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. For questions, I'll go ahead and queue questions in two ways. If you don't want to speak, you can put your questions in the chat box and I will go ahead and ask those. Or if you would like to ask yours through audio, please use your reaction button on the Zoom and raise your hand, and then I will call on you as appropriate. So to kick things off, I'm going to go ahead and ask Betty the first question. Congratulations. Now, so you mentioned a lot of what you're going to be doing in your role and some upcoming things you have planned. Will you be working in all the Sea Grant states? Is that the plan? And do you have a plan of action for your next movements in your position?
Yeah, good question. So, so my position is to support the entire Sea Grant network. Will I physically be working in all of the Sea Grant states? I'm funded for 4 years and I'm a year and a half in. I mean, I doubt it. There's only me to go around, but I'm certainly willing to support other activities in other states. So I'm here to support you to make those connections, to try to tap you into different resources. As far as the next plans, we're right now we're synthesizing the workshop summary for Chesapeake Bay and trying to see where that goes. It was a lot of work to do 2 back-to-back workshops, and I'm also working with Lisa on one in Florida. So I can't really answer that question. That's something that I will be, working with my federal partners on trying to decide what where they want to go next, because they're a major part of that equation. But certainly, my first year and a half has been really heavily focused on the East Coast. I'd love to come visit the West Coast or the Great Lakes if we identify needs in those areas.
Great, thank you. So that was a good segue. I'll go ahead and go to Lisa next. And a reminder, go ahead and put your questions in the chat or use your raise hand function and I will insert you in. Lisa, you mentioned your first symposia and what the products you put together, the task forces and their plans, and then now you have the second symposia coming up. Were there lessons learned or things that went well, either one in the first symposia that you are definitely either going to improve upon or repeat within the next one?
Yeah, I think the first lesson learned, or success, which I touched upon in the presentation, was making sure that your steering committee is filled with those individuals who are engaged and have work at the agency level. And so we're repeating that for the second one, but because we're focusing specifically on cyanoHABs, we've also actually increased our scope. And so we have representation from our local water management district and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who are both critical players. We're also engaging with the U.S. HAB and hypoxia working group. That initiative is responsible for implementing the South Florida harmful algal bloom initiative. And so we're making sure that they are engaged in the process along the way so that we're not duplicating efforts, and so that the consensus and priorities that arise from our symposia gets directly sort of inputted into their requirements. And lastly, I think unlike Chris's, which is more of a conference to report on the research that they funded, our symposia really wants to focus on the state of the science overall. And so most of our presentations really focus on that it's not research project specific. And if it is, it's really quick and really focuses just on the takeaways. It's more of this overview, like a review style presentation, so that individuals aren't reporting on a very specific project, but that we can have a broader breadth of information presented. And so that's it. I don't know, Betty, maybe we'll have some thoughts also as what's worked really well.
Betty, do you have any addition?
No, I think that's it. They have a good facilitator. I would definitely say if you're going to do that type of workshop, if make sure that you're reaching out to somebody early on if it's not you that's going to do it in-house, because there's some really good facilitators, and they can make or break a workshop or symposium.
And I think the last thing to note is that this is an invitation only symposia, which I think is really important in terms of having open and honest dialogue in that safe space. And so you don't have the general public, you don't have members of the media, you don't have just these interested ancillary parties there. You really have that research and management community in the room.
Great, thank you. Julie, regarding the AHAB network and the coordination of it, can you talk a little bit about how that group is organized in terms of, is there a monthly meeting? Is there somebody that is in charge of coordinating the members? How does all that work in that process?
Yeah, thanks. Well, when the AHAB first organized after the workshop that we held up here, it was kind of on a volunteer basis. There was no program money for coordinator. Sea Grant and AUS were pitching in for, some staff support on that. And since there's become funds for a coordinator, we do have a coordinator. He said it, I don't want to misspeak here, but Thomas Farrugia is the AHAB coordinator, and I believe he's funded through the National Hab Advisory Pilot Program. So that was a big step forward for the AHAB group. And yes, there's monthly meetings. The website's been updated. AHAB held a workshop up in Anchorage in conjunction with our Alaska Marine Science Symposium, and there's another workshop planned. So the idea is that there's this network, there's a steering committee. I used to sit on that, but I'm not on that steering committee anymore. But our NOAA agent, Gay Sheffield, and Ginny, our director, is chair of the committee. We expanded the committee to include more tribal representation and more representation from across the state. So yeah, there's a direction on the Alaska kind of HAB working plan. One of the challenges I think we have in our state is that we're so spread out. We're so regional, and even when we come together as a group, there's not always consensus on even the message and the outreach that works for each region. And that's been a super interesting dynamic to see. Yeah, it just really depends on where you're at. Like my harvesters, they want to harvest shellfish. They want a solution. And we have clams coming in above the regulatory level, and the messaging that goes around that, and we've got some very conservative approach, of course, with the FDA limit set at 80 micrograms of toxin per 100 grams of shellfish. It's super challenging. So my community comes to me, and I've never seen a butter clam that's not above regulatory level, put it that way. And then I have questions, can I harvest the shellfish? And there's a lot of challenges with messaging, even regionally. So across the state, it's been hard to come together as like a unified voice for that. So right now there's just providing that platform, that space to talk, continued conversations about the direction that we want to take on as a state, and so far we've just been piecemealing these different monitoring programs in place. And that's another really big challenge, to have these start and stop. Everything's been grant funded or small pilot projects, and then trying to keep things going. Even in my community alone, I've only been able to work in a handful of locations. Lots of challenges in their state. And one thing that stands out when I listen to you guys talk is there's so much like state support in your states. Our state has really taken a hands-off approach, and this is why we have that AHAB network. It's people are trying to work around the problem and make solutions, but we don't have direct funding from our state. We don't have that routine monitoring. So yeah, just really challenging. But yeah, there's lots of good momentum. And I'd say that with the monthly calls, the meeting notes are out. If I can put the AHAB website into the link and people can explore. But yeah, there's a lot of good momentum with the group, and with the coordinator being able to help along the group is really important. Without that funded coordinator, we were kind of struggling, as different groups, regional groups were stepping up to for a year to take on the coordination of the group. But a lot of good communication, not perfect, a lot of messaging, and a lot of new research. Like the Arctic is popping right now with Don Anderson's work, and finding a lot of Alexandrium cysts up there and what that means to the impact of the subsistence food. So yeah, we're small group of people trying to do big work here. We've got a lot of coastline to cover. So
Great,
okay.
thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so final call for any more questions, and I'm going to direct my next question to Chris, and then if any others come in, we'll go ahead and take those. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Karen afterwards. Chris, you mentioned the research focus that you all had in those 4 categories and where they are, and a lot of the work that's been done. What is the next need from both the research and the outreach perspectives?
Yeah, I think from the research space, we're where we need to be. Again, because these are agency driven, they're very relevant and important to the state and to where we're at. And then, the fact that the entire country is dealing with this, a lot of the basic science is kind of trickling in from everywhere. So for me, it's just, you never, even though it's 2.5 million a year we're competing, or if we lump it 5 million, the human health ones are real expensive. You can't do a lot of trials in human health with that amount of money. So I would say, I think we've identified the majority of the gaps and the needs with the agencies. It's just not enough money to go around. As far as the outreach, and isn't that what we as Sea Grant programs struggle with all the time? It's the one thing where, like, are we getting it to the right populations? Is it in the right format? So I think we can do a lot more in that space. We have started to roll out what we're calling our 101 videos. So really these 90-second, 2-minute long videos that are like why you should care, right? Not to get in the weeds of the science, but why you should care. So we're really focusing in that space right now. I am happy to report, looks like we're going to be bringing on a HABS specific extension agent. We don't have one right now. That is kind of me as the director, which means clearly I'm dropping balls because the director can never get to all these things. But we are on a co-centers grant that looks like it's going to be renewed, and we should get an extension educator in the HAB space out of that. Yeah, I think that's about it.
That's great news. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank all of the speakers, and the work you are doing is really informative, and we're looking forward to hearing more moving forward from your programs. And Betty, as you make your way to various parts of the country and hopefully get your West Coast connection going, and Great Lakes. I want to say thank you very much, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Karen to bring us home.
Thank you very much, Brooke, and to all of our speakers. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and share your knowledge and your experiences. In addition, we also want to thank our planning committee. These are some of the similar names, but also a huge shout out to Brooke for actually leading our panel discussion as well. And last but not least, I wanted to let you guys know that later this spring, we're going to be attempting to do a national webinar on water resources data sources. We're not sure exactly when that's going to happen right now, but if you would like to help with the planning committee on that, please put your name in the chat or reach out to me. We're looking for a team to help to figure out and plan that particular webinar that, like I said, will be sometime this spring or early summer. With all of that, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's so great to see everyone, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon again. And if any of you are not a part of the Water Resources Network and would like to join, please send me a message or also put your name in the chat and we'll get you added to that. Thank you all, and we'll be here if you have any last-minute questions.
Thank you for organizing this HAB section.
You bet, Julie. Thanks for joining us.
And please fill out the evaluation. The link is in the chat.
Thank you, Brooke.